Chapter 6 is kind of like an extension of what we learned in the last test, or last chapter, I should say. This is Genetics Advanced, okay, the advanced version. In the first version, we learned about all the ways that follow the normal pattern of genetics. What we call it Mendelian genetics. In other words, it follows a normal pattern of dominance and recessiveness. This is going to cover a lot of the things that are where it's a little bit different than this, like exceptions to that. Some of them have to will be things that just normally happen, and some of them are going to be things that may possibly lead to a genetic disease or the death of an organism or something like that. So there's two basic kinds of genetic changes that can take place to the nuclear material of an organism. One are called chromosomal changes. So here are all the things that we include in chromosomal changes. Either the number of the chromosomes or the arrangement of the genes on the chromosome gets changed. So we as humans have how many chromosomes? 46, okay? We have 46 chromosomes. So if anything that would change that, where we'd have a different number of chromosomes than 46, would be called a chromosomal change. Another change would be, it says the genes that are in the chromosome. Maybe they're in a new location or something, maybe they were in the middle, let's say, of the chromosomes, and now they're found toward the end or something like that. The other kind of mutation are called gene mutations, and this is where, remember that each gene is made up of a sequence of bases. We have the A for adenine, C for cytosine, T for thymine, and G for guanine. Maybe the order is different. So in other words, the three-letter word is actually a different word. So that's what we mean by a gene mutation. So, and we'll talk about how that can possibly take place. So when do these changes, when are they likely to occur? Well, they're likely to occur in one of the parts of meiosis. Okay, remember in meiosis 1, it begins with having instead of being 2N, now it's 4N. Or instead of one pair of all the chromosomes, I have actually two pairs of all the chromosomes. Then in the first division process, remember this is anaphase, and metaphase, anaphase, but no telophase yet. There's telophase, I'm sorry. There is telophase, but we're going from 4, I have 2 of everything, and then 2 of these will go one way, 2 of these will go the other way. So you can see that 2 of these went this way, 2 went that way. So I'm going from 4N to 2N. Then there's one more meiosis, the second meiosis that takes place, where these 2 will now separate and go into 2 different gametes, and the other pair over here will go into separate gametes. And then you have formed either 4 egg or 4 sperm. And an egg and a sperm together can fertilize each other. And so down here we're at 1 of every set. Not like we were up here where we had 4 of every set. We have 1 of every set, so we call that haploid. So we start out with 4N to 2N to 1N, and then 1N plus 1N makes 2N. This is diploid down here, which is really common in living things. So any questions? So during that process, that's when these changes can occur. A term that they bring up in section 6.1 is a word called Parthenogenesis. It's basically an organism that develops without the egg being fertilized. Organism that develops without an egg being fertilized. So it's just going to be haploid, or just N. And examples of this would be the drones. Like in a beehive, they have the drones, they have the worker bees, they have the drones, and then they have the queen. And the queen and the worker bees are diploid. In other words, they're formed in the normal method of sperm and egg. But the drones actually are fed, what's it called? Royal jelly, I think is what it's called. And it causes this unfertilized egg to actually develop into a bee. But it only has half the normal number of chromosomes. So they're sterile. They can't reproduce themselves. That's the job of the queen, and then there's one of the bees gets to fertilize. Okay, so remember we had haploid, diploid. Now we're going to introduce in this chapter a new term called euploidy. Euploidy. And euploidy means that you have one or more complete sets of chromosomes. So we are diploid, so we have two of each type of chromosome, so that's why we're diploid. Now here's a shorter one, we have two of those. Here's another bigger one, we have two of that one. Here's another bigger one, we have two of that. Notice that these are a little bit different, kind of where they pinch off in the middle is a little bit different place, so they're actually different chromosomes. And man and animals and most plants are like that, are diploid. Okay? So in other words, what we learned in the last chapter would probably fit humans, animals, and most plants. Now, triploid is where you have three, okay, have your set. So here's three different kinds of chromosomes, but of each type of chromosome I have three of them. So we call that triploid. Organisms that are triploid, are known to be triploid, are seedless plants, such as like watermelon. And when you buy a watermelon that doesn't have seeds, it's produced by a plant that is triploid. Banana the same way. Then we have some of them that are 4N. So of the four, here we have three different chromosomes, and we have four of each one of those. So that's why we have tetraploid, or 4N. Organisms that are tetraploid, or known to be that, are Irish potato, alfalfa, which there was an alfalfa field that I used to drive by when I drove to the other campus, but they started planting crops in there instead of harvesting alfalfa a couple years ago. So I don't know where the nearest alfalfa field is here, but I'm sure it has to be. You know where one is? Oh, you got a question? What is alfalfa? It's a plant that grows up, has lots of leaves on it, and it has a very long root system that makes it really good to grow. And we'll cut it, and when it's dried, we'll bale it. And animals really like that, to eat that, especially like during the winter months. A lot better than a lot of other things that we feed them. They really like alfalfa. But with the long roots, it can reach down to water, and so you can have a field of an alfalfa that's mature, where the roots are long, and it can be really dry in July and August, and here's a field that's totally green. Because it's bringing water from really deep. I think I've read that some of it can go down more than 20 feet down in the ground. I mean, that's a long set of roots. But they also enhance the condition of the soil. So I'm sure that the first year after they got rid of the alfalfa and planted crops inside of it, they probably grew quite well. Okay, now, then we have another kind of tetraploid. They have 4 chromosomes, 4 times the normal N, but in these, they're not 4 of this, of each kind. We have, like this set up here is 2 of every kind, and this set down here is 2 of every kind, and so we end up with 4, but we have like 2 different sets of 4 being put together. I mean, 2 sets of 2 being put together to give 4. And corn and wheat, corn we grow around here, and wheat are examples of plants that have this kind of chromosome or sets of chromosomes. Any questions? So we'll take that topic of euploidy, and now we're going to talk about polyploidy. And any cell or organism that has 3 or more complete sets of chromosomes is an example of an organism that is polyploidy. So 3 or more sets of chromosomes. So in other words, each set, remember, a set is N. They have 3N. But since it could be more than that, it could be like 4N, 5N. I can't think of examples that are 5N, other than we have 4N, examples that we already covered here. But the importance of plants, particularly, that are like this, are for agricultural purposes, because quite often we have chosen these plants because they have desirable characteristics, maybe because of the fruit that they produce, or some other good quality that we consider desirable. So let's start with the 3 kind, the triploid. And the triploid means 3N. And you might wonder, how did it ever get to be 3N? Well, it occurs when a gamete, which should be just N, in other words, they should have separated, one goes to this gamete, one goes to this gamete, but we had, at this time, we had both of them go to one gamete and make it diploid. Now, what do you think went to the other one? Like nothing, right? Or 0 on that side. And so that gamete's going to become nothing, because it doesn't even have the stuff it needs. But this got both of them. So instead of forming a haploid gamete, it formed a diploid gamete. If that diploid gamete fertilizes a gamete or an egg that is N, haploid, now I'll have 2N plus N, and now I'll have 3N. So that's how that happened. And so like seedless watermelon and bananas and things like that, that's how that happened. It does produce sterile gametes. In other words, when this organism is mature, it won't produce gametes that will help fertilize eggs. It has problems. And so seedless watermelons, if you think about it, if it doesn't produce any seeds, there's no way to reproduce itself. So we either have to figure out how we can make this happen again so we can have more seedless watermelon, which we kind of learn that process. But maybe like in some plants, maybe you can graft on a branch from a plant that is like that produces seedless, onto another plant, and now that branch will produce seedless. I mean, the other branches that are already there will still produce the ones with seeds. So we just harvest the ones we want. The other ones, like if this was like oranges, seedless oranges, the branches that produce oranges with seed, well, obviously we probably won't want to eat those, but we could probably still use them for what? Orange juice, right? Still tasty orange juice. When I lived in Phoenix, they had lots of orange orchards, especially as we went down to the southwestern part of the valley. There were a lot of orange groves down there, and they were really just grown for orange juice. I don't know if you've ever had tree-ripened, freshly squeezed orange juice. It's really nice and sweet. So some seedless fruits are that way. Not all seedless fruits are formed by this. So one thing, though, to remember is there are no living triploid humans. Thank you. Living triploid humans or examples in the animal kingdom. Now, I think what I would have to say, based on this wording right here, living triploid, it might be that they get crossed and maybe the egg is fertilized, it grows to a certain point, but maybe the defects that organism has are severe enough that if it's like a plant, the fruit never develops. Or if it's in an animal, maybe that animal, like that fetus dies or something like that. My wife and I, our first baby died at birth, and it or she had all kinds of physical defects. She had spina bifida was just one of the things that she had, and that's when the spine and the brain don't close up over it, so it's open. Sometimes it's just spina bifida, that's just where the back hasn't closed up, so the spinal cord's exposed at birth. Usually, quite often paralyzed from here on down, like that. But ours happened to die at birth. I think she would have had a really rough life if she had survived. So yeah, it was just probably a blessing from God. Now, one of the things that in the process, you wonder, are you going to have more children like that? And my wife's doctor said that miscarriages are much more common than people know, because most people who have a miscarriage don't really share that widely with other people. And many of the miscarriages, he said, are often a fetus that has defects. And it's kind of like I hate to use this word, but it's like natural abortion. It's just a natural process where this fetus is aborted because it's not normal. Now, that doesn't mean that we as humans are supposed to do that. That's God's doing, right? He chooses. Question I always had in my mind, I have probably come to reconcile in my mind that when I get to heaven, I'll get to see our daughter for the very first time. Because my wife and I, neither of us got to see it because they just whisked it away immediately. And my daughter, and I know she's mentioned a couple times, she's looking forward to seeing her big sister, someday. But, so I wonder if, in that process is similar to what our situation was, where maybe it wasn't a normal cross. And there was something genetically wrong, and that's just God's ways of kind of sparing that individual of a very difficult life and parents but that doesn't mean that God always does it that way, And it's not to punish us, when that happens. Remember the story in where the disciples are asking, this, I think this person was born blind and wanted to know, did this person sin or did his parents sin that he was born blind? What was Jesus' answer? Answer, neither. God wanted him born blind so that he could do what? Perform a miracle in him so he could see, So bad things don't mean that God's angry with us. He often wants these bad things, from our perspective, to be examples of ways that he can show his glory to humans. So, it kind of changes the way we look at, these things. Now, the tetraploid, we said that was like the Irish potato and alfalfa. This is 4N. Turns out that most of our cells in our body are 2N. But we have some places in our body that we actually have cells that are 4N, that are tetraploid. Turns out that some liver cells are this kind. Now, there must be some reason about, and I think I remember reading your book. We haven't really figured out what the reason is. Why is that a good thing? But it turns out apparently not a bad thing to be like that. Now, the Irish potatoes was an example of tetraploid. What do you know about the Irish potato? Remember the Irish potato famine? Probably studied that in history, right? The Irish potato is an example of where there's actually two sets of chromosomes added together. Not just 4 of each one, but actually 2 different sets that are added together. It forms diploid gametes, and a diploid gamete from this plant and a diploid gamete from this plant can fertilize and produce another organism. Now, it turns out that Irish potatoes aren't the only ones that are tetraploid. The corn that we grow in our area is tetraploid. Cotton is another plant that's tetraploid, and wheat is also tetraploid. Now, we said the Irish or the white potato. There's white potatoes and red potatoes. Red potatoes, most of the red potatoes we grow in the U.S. come from where? Often the most very desirable potatoes. They come from what? Idaho, right. And my wife and I, the kind of potatoes that we grew up with, that were often planted in gardens, were actually red potatoes, not white potatoes. White potatoes are often used for like baking potatoes and things like that. One thing we like about red potatoes is they're much more moist. White potatoes tend to be a little on the dry side, and we like our potatoes a little more moist. Now, the cells of an Irish potato have actually 48 chromosomes. They have 48 of these chromosomes, but there are 2 of every set. And so this doubles, 2 of this set and 2 of this set makes 4 altogether, but it's not 4 of the same thing. So when the 4 homologs line up to form a tetrad during meiosis, the chromosomes don't segregate properly, and so you're going to end up with gametes that get 2 and 2. So when you put the 2 together, you end up with 4. But if one of these gametes gets 2, instead of each getting a haploid, that means there's going to be some gametes that don't get any. any of those chromosomes. That's going to be a bad thing. Okay? So these gametes are not fertile, which means if they were to fertilize an egg, nothing really ever becomes of it. It kind of dies before it matures. Maybe it won't even go anywhere at all. So so this has a negative thing to it. So one of the problems with Irish potatoes, because of that, if you want to grow more Irish potatoes, you typically have to do what? I don't know, have any of you planted potatoes in your own garden? What did you do? Okay, you cut the potato in pieces, and each piece has to have an eye on it, because each eye is actually like a embryonic potato plant. So when I put it in the ground, that fleshy part of the potato is going to supply the food for that little embryonic plant to grow, develop roots and leaves, and finally when that is exhausted, it's able to make its own food and grow from that. So if I plant potatoes like that, what's going to be true of the potatoes in my garden? What's going to be true of the potatoes in my garden if I cut up a potato in chunks and planted the pieces? I'll have more potatoes, that's true. But how will they compare with each other? They're all going to be identical. They're all like clones of each other. They're actually not clones, it's probably not the best word to use, but they're all genetically identical to each other. So if I like this potato because of its quality, like I like how moist it is, or how thick the skin is, I don't want the skin to be too thick and tough, things like that, then I will like all the potatoes in the whole garden, because they all have the same genetic makeup. So farmers use the eyes of potatoes to produce the crop, but it's asexually, so they're not sperm and egg. One of the things I remember when I was younger and we were growing potatoes, yes, they would put these little chunks of potato in the ground and grow into another plant, but what we didn't want the plant to do is to basically bloom and make seeds, because we weren't after the seeds, we were after the potatoes. And so I remember one time my younger brother and I, was to go around in the potato patch and just tromp on all the plants, just kind of stomp them down so that they wouldn't fertilize. We wanted them to put all their energy into making potatoes, don't put any energy into making seeds, because we were not after the seeds. Now, aneuploidy is where you're lacking some chromosomes, or you have some extra chromosomes. And here are a couple examples of syndromes that have either more extra chromosomes or they lack some chromosomes. So some of you have heard of like Down syndrome. It would be an example of someone who has an extra chromosome. They actually have an extra chromosome number 21. We know exactly which chromosome they have an extra of. So think back in the process of how these chromosomes line up in the middle and they're supposed to separate into the gametes. There was one of these somewhere along the line that didn't split, one go to one gamete and one to the other of a pair. They both went to the same one. All the others split normally, but there was one of them, chromosome 21, that split abnormally. And apparently that is more likely to happen if the mother is older when that child is born. Grace Moses has a little brother who has Down syndrome. And I don't know, I never did, we were talking about that in her biology class about that, what it's like, what in the range of what we call Down syndrome, you have quite a range. You have some of them that are, well, there's no way that they could ever live alone. They need somebody to care for them all their life. But then there are some who have Down syndrome that actually have quite a few abilities. They can hold a simple job. They can live on their own. They typically have those people living what we call in group homes, where there are other people that are handicapped in some way, and there's someone who's just kind of like a caretaker, in case they need something. But otherwise, they can, maybe to help them manage their money and stuff like that. But for the most part, they can get ready in the morning, they can go to work, they can, dress themselves, do all those things that is totally normal. It's just that typically their mental ability, which is one of the things that is affected by Down syndrome, is kind of not, enough for them to be able to totally survive on their own. It doesn't mean they can't reason. Grace says that her little brother has trouble processing. In other words, it's not that he doesn't know something, he just doesn't know how to connect what you just said with what he knows. It takes a little longer for that. Like if he knows what an apple is, but if you ask him to get you an apple, it takes him longer to do that because he has to process what you're asking first. And different people have different processing speed. We don't all process our information at the same speed. Some people, boy, they can process just like this. Others we take a little longer, to process it. We're all made a little different. So this is caused by something called non-disjunction. Non-disjunction. This is where a chromosome pair fails to separate. Like I told you, two of them go one way and none the other way for that one chromosome. Instead of one going one way and one going the other way, they're all supposed to do that. We had one of them that didn't do that. And it's typically chromosome 21 for Down syndrome. We have other syndromes that, there's Turner syndrome and Klinefelter syndrome that are have kind of some of that same stuff going on. These up here, Turner syndrome is one where in that splitting and forming a gamete, they're getting the gamete that didn't get that one chromosome. Kind of like that. So it'd be sort of like the opposite of what Down syndrome would be. So if you kind of think about this, having 2N is special. But what we consider normal is actually special because we get 2 of everything. If it's not 2 of everything, then you get something different than that. Maybe, and if you think about this, having one chromosome missing of a pair, what is true of all the genes that are on this chromosome? They'll all express themselves, right? There's nothing on the other one that could possibly mask it. And if there was something dominant on the other one, it's not there to mask it, so the recessive traits will always show up. And so you can kind of see, if this is a certain chromosome that has genes for certain traits, then all those traits, for those traits, you're going to have all the recessive ones for those traits, which sometimes makes no difference. Sometimes it might be something negative. I guess it's even possible it could be something positive too, So we say they have N plus 1 if they have an extra chromosome, or N minus 1. Now we're talking here about the gametes, right? They normally have 2N, but we're talking about the gametes being just N, but We have some of them that have an extra chromosome, like the bottom one, or some that are short one chromosome. So in this one up here, if this was a human that has Turner syndrome, instead of having 46 chromosomes, they'll have how many? Only half. What's the math? You have 45 chromosomes. This one down here, if you're Down syndrome, you don't have 46, you have 47 chromosomes. So 46 produces the normal characteristics that you and I think of. And then if you're short one chromosome, now whichever chromosome you're short will probably produce a different syndrome. Now, there are some chromosomes, if you're missing it, you're not going to survive. You might not even be born.